Fraud by deception is a crime where someone intentionally misleads other persons or using lies, half truths, or forged information to unlawfully obtain money, property, or service. We're going to get into this, ladies and gentlemen, because a lot of people have a whole lot of cases, especially in the African American community, where they not educate y'all on fraud by deception when it came to them vaccines. But we're going to get into it. Y'all make that decision up on y'all own, because it's a lot of cases that's being heard behind these vaccines, where a lot of people was fraud by deception, all lies. They didn't have the truth and didn't have the facts, and people got paid off of it. Whereas though African American community are not being educated on fraud by deception by the government that made you line up and take an experiment. It's a lot of cases that's going on right now that y'all have no clue of, because they're brainwashing y'all with a Trump deranged, or they not telling y'all the truth. It's for you to get the information and do your own research. And if you was lined up and you took the experiment, you have a nice case, ladies and gentlemen. Section 192B.
I get letters all the time, and I hear from people who have been taken advantage of in financial transactions. And, you know, it really is, it's sad. And a lot of it isn't even, it's not fraud or anything. For one thing, I mean, just the charges involved, the frictional costs, and the baloney that is presented is tough. Charlie and I have had very good luck in terms of buying businesses and putting our trust in people. It's been just overwhelmingly good, but we filter out a lot of people. And then they say, how do you filter them out? I would say, and I think Charlie will agree with this, people give themselves away fairly often, and maybe it does help to have been around as long as we have, in seeing the various ways they give themselves away. When somebody comes to me with a business, and I probably shouldn't tell this publicly because they'll probably tailor their approach subsequently, but when they come, just the very things they talk about, what they regard as important and not important, there are a lot of clues that come as to subsequent behavior. And like I say, we've really had a batting average I wouldn't have thought we would have had in the people that we've joined with, but it hasn't been 100%. It's been well above 90, and I get asked that, you know, I mean, how do you make those judgments? And I don't know, Charlie, can you articulate the way we do it?
Well, partly we're deeply suspicious when the proposition is too good to be true. Warren once introduced me to a gentleman promoter who wanted to inveigle us into an insurance program, and he said, We only write fire insurance on concrete bridges that are covered by water. He says it's like taking candy from babies. We are able to filter out propositions like that.
Yeah, anybody that implicit in their comments or what they kind of laugh about or all kinds of things in terms of the fact, it's so easy and it ain't that easy, and we get suspicious very quickly. And the truth is we rule out 90% of the times, and we may be wrong about a fair number that we're ruling out. The important thing is whether the ones we're ruling in we're right about. And so we don't mind. We're looking for the obvious cases of people you can trust.
I think you really ought to tell about the experience with the fraud claim.
What?
On the fraud claim, the fidelity claim with the guy, he had a very well-known insurance company that you don't have to name names, but you basically told him just raise the stakes to make the game fair. This was back in the 1960s. Do you remember that?
I don't remember.
Oh, well, I do. I remember.
Well, tell it then.
Charlie had this tiny little operation which he ran as fund, also had a seat on the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange. The firm was called Wheeler Munger. It was called Wheeler Munger at first. Later it changed itself to Munger Wheeler. And Jack Wheeler said, well, pretty soon it'll be Munger and Company, but that's okay. Jack Wheeler was a very interesting guy, and he had the specialist position in General Motors and a few things. And some employee stole I don't know, $12,000 or something like that from the firm.
I remember he had the trading tickets.
Yeah, some guy steals some money, and Charlie's firm, Wheeler Munger, was required to have a fidelity bond and all these things that covered dishonest employees and all of that sort. So this guy's clearly dishonest. He's clearly stolen the money. So Charlie puts in a claim for $12,000 or something like that, whatever the loss was, and sends it to this very big and prestigious insurance company. And of course, the insurance company denies his claim. They say, the guy really wasn't employed, he doesn't exist, you don't have a dog, I mean, the whole thing. And Charlie gets this letter back, and they're not going to pay the claim. And so Charlie writes a letter to this very well-known, big-name person that runs the insurance company. And he said, he said, we have this $12,000 claim. And he said, this guy stole the money. And we thought we had an insurance policy against people stealing, to pay the people stole money. And he said, we're in this very interesting position because you've got a bunch of people on the payroll, and they're going to get their weekly check or monthly check, whatever they do. So they just say, we're not going to pay, and life goes on. Whereas I'm sitting here, and I've got my time, and I got to work on this thing, and it isn't worth the $12,000 for me to fool around with this claim against the company, and they'll appeal it and all these things. So he said, I know that you would be offended by the thought that you might be using this inequality of bargaining position to avoid paying at the claim. That never could be your intention. So what I suggest, in order to really live up to your code of behavior, is why don't we make the $12,000 claim, we'll just multiply it by 10 and call it $120,000 either way. And if you lose, you pay me $120,000. If I lose, I'll pay you $120,000. Now it's worth my while. And he addresses the letter to the chairman and says that's the guy. He gets a $12,000 check by return mail.
About the potential vaccination and treatments that are being approved by the FDA. But I also caution against these criminal organizations and individuals that will exploit the American public. We need to be cautious of illicit websites. HSI has analyzed over 60,000 websites that were suspected to be involved in some sort of COVID-19 related fraud. Homeland Security Investigations launched Operation Stolen Promise in April of this year to combat the
study linking childhood vaccines to autism was in fact an outright fraud. The report says a 1998 autism study wasn't just wrong, it was deliberately faked. The editor of the British medical journal Lancet, which first published that study, calls the findings shocking.
It is deeply shocking that fraud of this sort takes place and on such an important issue and with such potential to damage the public health.
The original study triggered a worldwide downturn in vaccination rates for measles, mumps, and rubella, and a resulting surge in childhood measles.
Here's the point I'm trying to make to the African American community. Fraud by deception is a crime where someone intentionally misleads other persons or intentionally using lies, half-truths, or forged information to unlawfully obtain money, property, or services. Who made money off the COVID-19 experiment, ladies and gentlemen? Who told you was going to lose your job if you didn't line up and take an experiment? The news was involved. It was global. So like I said, behind the scenes, there's a lot of lawsuits behind this that's being prepared, ladies and gentlemen. And as an African American, and our peoples are not educated, once again, fraud by deception was a major part going on during that experiment. And a lot of y'all that lined up and took that experiment got a case, but they're blinding y'all with foolishness and not giving you the truth. I would suggest anyone out there that took that experiment that's having any type of health, medical conditions that you didn't have before taking that experiment, talk to a lawyer. All right? Let's get into this.
COVID shots have negative efficacy after 6 months. Tell me how a shot with negative efficacy is saving lives and it has the worst side effect profile of any vaccine in human history. So how exactly is a vaccine with the worst side effects and negative efficacy saving lives? That's a preposterous claim. What ended the COVID pandemic was the Omicron variant that was more transmissible but less lethal. The vaccine, how many people it helped? I think it's an open debate. It could be a net negative.
COVID vaccine has worst side effects ever, Dr. Rogers McJaw dropping claim at Senate hearing. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, you've been bamboozled, you've been hoodwinked, you've been misinformated, led astray, and everything that come with that. Fraud by deception.
I think Mr. Series kind of covered the 154 million, which was the first time I heard that. And again, I would call that propaganda. It's not science. I mean, if somebody's got some model, fine. I mean, I can play with numbers too. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you how you can use numbers. Dr. Scott, you talked about the Commonwealth estimate of 3.2 million lives saved here in the U.S. in 2021 and 2022, correct? You're pretty confident of that one?
It's one of a few studies. Yep, these estimates are not easy to make, but yeah, that's one study.
Define study. I mean, were there confidence intervals around that 3.2 million?
It was a modeling study, yeah, with certainly.
It was published on a blog, wasn't it? Is that correct, Mr. Siri?
Yeah, it's a blog.
That study
was
covered on.
Yeah, the Commonwealth quote unquote study is not a study, it's a blog. It's not a peer-reviewed study, it's not in a journal, it was published.
So let's put up this little chart that I'm somewhat famous for charts. So let's look at real data. So this is CDC data. So in 2019, total deaths in the US were 2.85 million. Okay, then we have the pandemic year, 2020, 3.38 million, a little under 3.4 million. So that's an increase of a little more than 500,000 people died in the first year of COVID. The following year, 3.46 million people, more people in the second year of the pandemic, 2021, when the vaccines were rolling out. And I think we were close to 70% take up of vaccines by fall of 2021, I believe.
Some of the estimates are that by the second quarter, over 60% of Americans had some form of.
Then in 2022, we started backing down. Now, I think Mr. Siri kind of argues in your piece that, the vaccines really worked. You'd think even by 2021, because those things are being rolled out pretty quick, you'd probably see those death counts come down, but they didn't. But here's the point I'm trying to make with this Commonwealth Fund study. They estimated 3.2 million people's lives were saved in 2021 and 2022. So if you add that to the actual death count, what Commonwealth Fund is assuming is that in 2021, had it not been for the vaccines, more than 5 million people would have lost their lives in America. In 2022, 4.88 million people would have lost their lives. I mean, Dr. Scott, is that even close to credible to think that we go from 2.85 million lives lost in 2019, have a pandemic, no vaccines? Unfortunately, the NIH was sabotaging treatment using effective generic drugs, to telling people, don't treat at all, go home, be afraid, hope you don't have to go in the hospital where they'll plug remdesivir in your veins and hook you up to a ventilator and you probably never come off, okay? So we had no treatment, had 3.38 million people die that year. Are we really supposed to believe that next year we were gonna leap up to 5 million lives lost in America? And then the following year, close to 5 again? Because that's what you'd have to be. In order to save 1.6 million lives in 2021 and 2022, you'd have to be assuming the death rate was going to go from 2.85 million in 2019, 3.4 million in 2019, and then leap up to 5 million in 2021 and 22. Is that at all plausible? Do you believe that? Do you believe that we were literally, had it not been for vaccine, 5 million Americans would have lost their lives in 2021 and 2022?
Yeah, I believe that's credible to me. I mean, were you on the front lines? Because it was awful. I honestly cannot express how terrible it was.
It was terrible.
And there was a dramatic,
it was
terrible.
Decline. It was terrible in 2020.
There was a dramatic
was
decline in death
3.4
rates after the vaccines were rolled out.
Well,
Dramatic.
Let's move on. Let's move on to some other.
Parse over these modeling studies, but let's talk about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. I mean, there were a number of studies that looked into that.
This is
some
about,
of which I was involved in.
This is about research. I'm by the way, I'm happy to invite you back when I'll have Dr. McCulloch and I have Dr. Good. We'll do that. Okay, we will absolutely have you come back.
Thank you.
And we'll talk about hospital protocols. We'll talk about early treatment. I would love to do that because I've never been able to get people to actually debate or discuss this with the doctors did have the courage and compassion to treat COVID. Okay, and I appreciate you did as well. So anyway, so you think it's credible? I mean, the records show that Dr. Scott thinks, yeah, we had 5 million people die in 2021 and 2022. Mr. Siri, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I could add to that just a little bit, which is that, and this is part of my submission as well, that the data reflects that in 2020, when there was no vaccine, the vaccine was first rolled out at the end of December 2020, about 18% of folks, 17% of Americans were infected. And presumably, by the way, the weakest, most frail among us passed away in 2020. And we get to 2021, where again the data reflects, and this is my submission, around the same percentage of Americans were again infected. Okay, so no vaccine, like you pointed out, that was the increase.
Fraud by deception.
The vaccine in 2021,
Sir.
the vaccination rate went through. Well,
He's
sky high by
standing
the
on it
second
too,
quarter of
y'all.
2021.
He's standing on that
When
fraud
Delta's
shit,
coming,
yeah.
The immunity rate, according to the data, is over 60%, but yet all-cause mortality increases. And I'll point out one last thing about this. Remdesivir, and this is a great example of corruption.
You know what nurses call that? Run, death is near.
Well, I'll give you an example of corruption of science with remdesivir.
The way you should do a study is you come up with a study design and then you implement it, because this way you avoid introducing bias. If you start the study and then you're like, ooh, you don't like what you're finding, and you change the study design, that introduces bias. And that is exactly what happened during the remdesivir clinical trial. The endpoints in the middle of the trial were changed by Gilead as it was going on. In fact, we wrote to Dr. Fauci specifically about that. That is precisely what you should never do. It introduces bias so they can get the results.
All right, do you remember how many people have some kind of financial conflict of interest and people that approved that?
Oh,
Gilead?
Yes.
It's like 9 out of 16 or something like that.
A significant number, and obviously, there's lots of folks who've treated COVID during the pandemic, and there's lots of, you had Dr. Jordan here, for example, and he's had a clinic. I think he has dozens and dozens of clinics around the country, and he lost, as he would explain, the protocols he implemented, lost very few people to COVID. I know other doctors in that similar situation using budesonide and so forth.
So, Dr. Rogers, you have something, Dr. Scott, I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I want to add to this debate. So I watched every single meeting of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices and the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee in 2021, 2022, and 2023, when all these COVID shots were being authorized for use in this country. And after a while, the CDC's own research showed that the protection from the vaccine, if any, was between months 2 and 6. And by 6 months, it showed negative efficacy. So I'm watching the hearings on my, computer screen at home. I'm yelling at the screen. The COVID shots have negative efficacy after 6 months. Tell me how a shot with negative efficacy is saving lives, and it has the worst side effect profile of any vaccine in human history. So how exactly is a vaccine with the worst side effects and negative efficacy saving lives? That's a preposterous claim. What ended the COVID pandemic was the Omicron variant that was more transmissible but less lethal. The vaccine, how many people it helped? I think it's an open debate. It could be a net negative.
I say it again, you've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked. Bamboozled. Led astray. Run amok. This is what he does.